When Attraction Meets Fear, a silent love story. It was an ordinary afternoon, the type that drifts by unnoticed for most people. In a small, quiet bookstore nestled in the heart of the city, two strangers were about to unknowingly cross paths. The bookstore, with its shelves lined with endless stories, smelled of old paper and new beginnings. In the back corner of the shop, a man stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface. His name didn't matter. He was just another face in a crowded city, doing his job, blending in with the mundane. He had always found comfort in the stillness of his days, the routine of sorting books, and the gentle hum of soft conversations from customers browsing through the aisles. He was content with his life, if not a little lonely. But that all changed the moment she walked in. She wasn't particularly extraordinary in appearance, but something about her drew his attention. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the way her eyes moved over the books with such care, as if each title held a memory of something she had yet to discover. She walked slowly through the aisles, occasionally brushing her fingers along the spines of the books, as if she were searching for something that felt familiar but elusive. He couldn't help but notice her, though he quickly looked away, focusing back on the task at hand. He wasn't the type to start conversations with strangers, and there was a hesitation deep within him that kept his words locked behind his lips. She was a woman with her own quiet story, one full of unanswered questions and quiet fears. She came to the bookstore often, drawn by the need to escape into worlds that were different from her own. The books gave her solace, even if only for a little while. But every time she stepped into the bookstore, she couldn't help but notice him. There was something about his presence that made her heart skip a beat. He wasn't like the others. There was a softness to him, a quiet kindness that seemed to radiate even without him saying a word. It was only a glance, just a brief meeting of their eyes across the room. But in that split second, something unspoken passed between them. She quickly looked down, her heart racing in a way she couldn't explain. He, too, felt something stir inside him. But fear and doubt clouded his thoughts. Could it be that she noticed him? Could it be that the connection he felt was real? Or was it just a figment of his imagination? Over the next few weeks, she came back to the bookstore, and each time they exchanged nothing more than polite nods or the occasional hello. The silence between them grew, stretching out longer and longer with each visit. He had always been a quiet person, but the tension between them made him feel like he couldn't even breathe. Every time she walked in, his heart would beat a little faster. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask her about the book she liked, wanted to know more about her, but his fears held him back. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if he said something wrong and embarrassed himself? It was easier to stay silent than risk rejection. She, too, felt the weight of the silence. She would watch him from across the room, always hoping for some sign, some small gesture that would tell her that he, too, felt the spark between them. But each time she thought of starting a conversation, the words would die in her throat. The fear of saying the wrong thing, of putting herself out there only to have him pull away, kept her from speaking. She was no stranger to fear, having carried it with her for much of her life. The fear of being vulnerable, the fear of opening up to someone. These were battles she had fought for years, and each time she had chosen silence. And so their lives continued in this quiet dance, each one afraid to take the first step. The bookstore became their refuge, a place where they could exist without needing to acknowledge the growing tension between them. He would focus on the books, and she would get lost in the pages, pretending that she wasn't thinking about him, pretending that the space between them didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than either of them wanted to admit. One rainy afternoon, the atmosphere in the bookstore felt different. The rain beat softly against the windows, and the usual chatter of customers was absent. The store was nearly empty, save for the two of them. She walked in, her umbrella dripping wet, and he looked up as she entered. There was no one else in the store, and for a brief moment, he felt like the entire world had shrunk down to just the two of them. He quickly went back to his work, hoping his nervousness wasn't too obvious. But this time, she didn't head straight for the shelves. She stopped by the counter and smiled at him, a quiet, shy smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Hello," she said softly. His throat tightened. He had never heard her speak to him like this before, and the sound of her voice sent a wave of warmth through him. He forced himself to smile back, though he was sure it looked more like a nervous grimace than anything else. "Hi," he replied, his voice coming out softer than he intended. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken words, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was different. It was the kind of silence that hung in the air, full of possibility. She glanced down at the book in her hand, then back up at him. "This is a good one," she said, holding up the book she had been browsing through. "I've read it before, but I'm thinking of getting it again." He nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's a classic. I think it's one of those books that's always worth revisiting." She smiled again, a genuine smile that made something inside him flutter. He hadn't realized how much he had been longing for her to speak to him, how much he had hoped for this small moment to happen. She wasn't just another customer. She wasn't just a passing face. There was something more to her, something he couldn't quite explain. But then, just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it seemed to slip away. She placed the book back on the shelf and turned to leave. "Well, I'll think about it," she said, her voice trailing off. He watched her go, his heart heavy with the words he hadn't spoken. He had wanted to say something more, something that would bridge the gap between them. But the words hadn't come, and now she was walking out the door, disappearing into the rain. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door, wondering if he had missed his chance. Had he waited too long? Had his silence driven her away? He felt a deep ache in his chest, a longing for something he couldn't quite grasp. But as the door closed behind her, he realized something. It wasn't over yet. The story wasn't finished, and maybe, just maybe, they were both waiting for the courage to take the next step. The days following their brief interaction were filled with silence, but it wasn't an empty kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that carried the weight of unspoken words, of possibilities that were left hanging in the air. She continued to visit the bookstore, but each time there was something different about the way she moved through the aisles, something that made her seem more aware of the space around her, more conscious of the man behind the counter. He, too, found himself drawn to the bookstore in ways he hadn't been before. He would find himself scanning the shelves, not just for books to organize, but for any sign of her. And when she appeared, his heart would race in a way he couldn't explain. The brief moments they shared felt like little sparks of something more, but neither of them had yet found the courage to step into that space. One particular afternoon, the bookstore was nearly empty, with only a few customers scattered across the aisles. It was quiet, the only sound being the occasional rustling of pages or the soft clink of a book being placed back on the shelf. She walked in, her footsteps light but purposeful, as though she had something she needed to prove to herself. He noticed her right away, as he always did. But this time, something was different in the air. She walked past the aisles, her eyes scanning the books, as she always did. But this time, her gaze lingered longer, almost as if she was waiting for something. And then, without warning, she stopped in front of the counter where he was working, her eyes meeting his. There was no hiding the nervousness in his expression, but there was also a flicker of something else, something that told her that he had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. "Hi," she said, her voice softer than usual. But this time, it was more than a greeting. It was an invitation. She wanted to say more, but the words caught in her throat. She had come here today with the intention of speaking, of crossing the invisible line between them. But now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure if she could. He looked at her, his hand still on the counter, unsure of how to respond. He finally managed, his voice low and shaky. He could feel the tension between them, the invisible pull that seemed to bring them closer with each passing second. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to say anything more. She stood there for a moment, both of them caught in the quiet space of uncertainty. The sound of her breathing, the gentle rhythm of it, was all he could hear. He wanted to ask her about the book she was holding, to tell her how much he admired her taste in reading, to ask her what had brought her back. But he couldn't. The fear of rejection, of breaking the fragile connection they had created, kept him silent. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, she finally said, breaking the silence between them. About the book. I think it's time I read it again. He raised an eyebrow, a little confused. I don't remember exactly what I said, he admitted, his voice still soft. But there was a hint of curiosity in it now. She smiled, a small, almost shy smile, and then shrugged slightly. You said it was one of those books that's worth revisiting. I think I agree. I keep thinking about it, you know? How sometimes we need to go back to things, even when we think we've outgrown them. He nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. He had often felt that way himself, like he was constantly revisiting things from his past, trying to understand them in new ways. But he hadn't expected her to open up like this. There was a vulnerability in her words that caught him off guard, a glimpse into her own fears and struggles. I think we do, he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. We can't always move forward without taking a look back. Sometimes it's the things we thought we were done with that can teach us the most. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw beyond the man behind the counter. She saw someone who, like her, was trying to figure out life, trying to make sense of the things that didn't always add up. There was something comforting in that, in his quiet understanding. She didn't have to explain everything to him. She didn't have to share the pain she had carried for so long. In that moment, she knew that he saw her for who she truly was. I've always been afraid, she said suddenly, her words slipping out before she could stop them. Afraid of things not turning out the way I want. Afraid of being vulnerable. He didn't know what to say at first. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the weight of her words hanging between them. It was the truth she had kept hidden for so long, and now she had shared it with him. He wanted to say something to ease her pain, to tell her that he understood, but all he could do was look at her, his gaze steady but full of uncertainty. I think we all are, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. We're all afraid of something, but sometimes you have to let go of that fear, even if, just for a moment. Otherwise, you'll never know what could be. She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. There was truth in what he said, a truth she had been avoiding for so long. She had kept herself guarded, kept her heart locked away, afraid of letting anyone in. But with him, there was something different. There was a chance, however small, that maybe, just maybe, she could let her guard down and let him in. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind a soft golden light that filtered through the windows. The bookstore, once just a place for quiet escape, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could both be honest with themselves. He took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people standing in the quiet space of their own fears, their own hopes, trying to figure out what came next.
I'm not sure what happens next, he said, his voice calm but uncertain. But I know that I don't want this to end.
Not like this. She looked at him, her heart racing in her chest.
Neither do I, she whispered. And just like that, without needing to say more, they both understood.
They had both taken the first step, the hardest step. They had acknowledged the fear, and in doing so, had opened the door to something new. The future was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, they didn't need to know everything. They just needed to take that next step together. The weeks that followed that afternoon seemed to stretch on, but they were also filled with moments that both of them would treasure. Something had shifted between them, and though neither of them was quite ready to put it into words, they both felt it. The walls they had so carefully built around themselves began to crack, little by little, allowing them to peer into each other's worlds. She continued to visit the bookstore, though now there was a new sense of anticipation when she walked in. Each time she entered, her eyes would automatically scan the room, looking for him behind the counter. And when their eyes met, there was a quiet acknowledgement between them, a soft connection that hadn't been there before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. For him, things were different too. He had always enjoyed his work, but now it felt like he was a part of something bigger, something that went beyond the rows of books and the quiet atmosphere of the shop. It was her presence, the way she had made him feel seen in a way he hadn't realized he needed. She had opened something inside him, something he had kept hidden for far too long. Still, there was an unspoken hesitation between them. They were both afraid of what might happen if they took the next step, afraid of what it might mean to truly open up to someone else. But with each passing day, they both came to realize that the fear wasn't as paralyzing as it once was. They were still afraid, yes, but they were learning how to be afraid together. One afternoon, she arrived at the bookstore earlier than usual. The weather had turned cool, and the gentle breeze outside had brought with it a quiet stillness that seemed to wrap around the world like a soft blanket. She stepped inside, the familiar scent of the books greeting her like an old friend. She didn't immediately see him behind the counter, so she wandered over to the far side of the store, letting her fingers trace the spines of the books as she went. It wasn't long before he appeared, stepping out from the back room, his eyes scanning the store before they landed on her. There was a brief pause, a moment of hesitation, before he made his way over to her. The way he walked, his movements slow and deliberate, told her that something had changed. He wasn't just walking toward her because it was his job. He was walking toward her because he wanted to, and she felt it in her chest, that quiet stirring of hope. "Hi," he said when he reached her, his voice soft but warm. It wasn't just a greeting. It was a step forward, a decision to move beyond the silence they had shared for so long. She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Hi," she replied, her heart skipping a beat. There was something different in the way he looked at her now, something deeper than just a casual glance. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. "I was just thinking about that book we talked about," he said, gesturing toward the shelf where she had found it.
I think it's one of those books that changes every time you read it. At least, that's how I feel.
She nodded, her gaze shifting to the book in question. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it too. Sometimes you go through life and you don't realize how much you've changed until you look back at things you thought you understood. It's funny, isn't it?" He smiled at her words, the warmth in his expression making her feel like they were sharing something personal, something meaningful. It was a rare moment, one of those brief glimpses into something real, something that went beyond the surface. They stood there for a moment, neither of them saying anything, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The silence between them felt different now. It wasn't heavy or awkward. It was just the space where they could exist together, side by side, without needing to rush into anything. "So, what's next for you?" he asked after a beat, his voice gentle but curious. She glanced at him, a little surprised by the question. It was the first time he had asked her something like that, something that went beyond the books and the store. And for a moment, she hesitated. What was next?
What did she want? The question was simple, but it felt big.
She had spent so much time looking at the world through the lens of fear, always wondering what would happen next, but never really allowing herself to think about what she wanted for herself. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I think I've been so afraid of what might happen next that I haven't really thought about it. Maybe it's time to change that." He nodded, as though he understood exactly what she meant. "I think that's a good place to start. Sometimes we don't realize how much we've been holding back until we decide to let go." She smiled at his words, a small, knowing smile. There was a sense of peace in them, a quiet assurance that maybe they were both on the same path, even if they couldn't see the end of it yet. "Maybe I'm ready to take that next step," she said softly, her words more to herself than to him. "Maybe we both are."
There was a moment of quiet understanding between them, one that spoke volumes without needing any more words.
They didn't need to figure it all out in that moment. There would be time for that later. For now, they had taken the first step together. The following days continued in much the same way, small, quiet steps forward. The bookstore became more than just a place to browse books. It became a place where they learned to be vulnerable, to share the silence between them without fear. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the old doubts crept in, moments when fear threatened to take over again. But they had both learned something important, that they didn't have to face those fears alone. As time passed, their connection grew, slowly but steadily. There was no grand declaration, no rush to put labels on what they were building. It was simply a matter of two people finding each other in the quiet, taking the time to understand each other, and letting the rest of the world fade away for a while. They didn't know what the future held. They didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. For the first time, they had learned that it wasn't the destination that mattered. It was the journey, the small moments, the quiet understanding they had shared. And so, their story continued, written not in bold, dramatic gestures, but in the simple, quiet steps they took together. And in that simplicity, they had found something beautiful.